Good day, my name is H.B. Charles Jr. I'm the pastor teacher of the Shiloh Church in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm the author of several books. I write a blog as well that can be found at hbcharlesjr.com. And I have a new podcast entitled the On Preaching Podcast that can be found on iTunes. It is my joy to have this conversation with pastor of the Full Gospel Baptist Church and True Samaritan Baptist Church in Los Angeles, California, longtime friend, Pastor Reginald C. Payne. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be here.
So this it's going to be a weird interview because you might be one of my oldest friends. We've known each other for a very, very long time.
Yes.
So this is just going to be some of the parts of the story, I know, but I'm glad to have you here with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Reginald Payne, lead pastor at Full Gospel Baptist Church. I've been there. This is my 22nd year. Also, about 3 years ago, I assumed leadership of another congregation in Los Angeles called the True Samaritan Baptist Church. I'm originally born in Monroe, Louisiana. My parents moved to Los Angeles when I was about a year old, and the rest of my days have been there in Los Angeles.
So you grew up in a Christian home?
Grew up in a Christian home. My mom was completely devoted to the Lord, loved the Lord, worker in church. My dad knew of Christ from a young age, but just was not really practicing and walking in the faith. And so he was kind of the person that was not going to let me get away with what he got away with. So it was kind of like, look, you're not going to stay home with me. The right thing to do is go and worship. Even though I'm not doing it, you're not going to use me as an excuse to not do it. So in that regard, my mom was more so the guiding force for me as far as my relationship with Christ.
Sure. So when would you say you personally met Christ and had that?
I personally would say I met Christ about the age of 10 years old, 1800 South Gramercy Place, Los Angeles, 918. Dr. H.B. Charles Sr. was preaching the word of God, and I just responded to the message of Christ and came and gave my life to him and was baptized in the Mount Sinai Church.
What point did you say we met?
I would probably say we met more than likely probably when I was probably in my teen years where we really connected. And I think a lot of that kind of started when we were, I think we were two of the preachers in the church who escaped the actual title of junior deacon.
Yeah.
I think, we just, had an opportunity during some of the communion days when it was young people involved that Dr. Charles would allow us to do that. And I just think from there, just around the church and just in youth groups, our relationship started to develop and bud and grow from there.
So we didn't have all of the, man, I go to some churches and I see their youth centers and all of this. And I say, man, we didn't have any of that.
No, sir.
None of that. We didn't have our own buildings and our Disney decorated,
No, sir.
But those were spiritually formative years.
Absolutely.
There were strong men in that church. There was a seriousness about teaching in that church. And this is my struggle to this day. There was a lot for the young people, but it wasn't this. We were being integrated into the life of the church, not this separate thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. I think our fundamental development came through number one, Sunday school. I mean, if we were in there trying to escape or skate out of Sunday school,
right,
it was like we had a spiritual truant officer on the grounds, and you was gonna get yanked and drug into Sunday school. And I think that was one of the places. And then just in other areas, as you said, being assimilated into the life of the church. So we knew nothing about a children's church or a nursery. It was like in that congregation, the babies was in the worship, the young people were in the worship, and you needed to listen and pay attention. I think that was where I got my formative, development in just settings like that.
So, there's no way I would be where I am if I grew up in a church setting where I was totally disconnected from the main assemblies of the people. We had, I feel like, just as much as my church now has for young people, but it was just integrated. We had a children's choir, tender voices, deacons, ushers, all of these things, but they were finding ways to integrate us, to teach us how to worship.
Right.
And we were connected to the body life.
Right, exactly.
Of the
Exactly.
church. Yep.
Yeah.
So, I preached my first sermon when I was 11 years old. And I preached my first sermon during the youth choir musical.
Yes,
At
sir.
the time, you were the president
Yes, sir.
of the youth choir. How did you become the president of the youth choir when you have no ability to sing, Reggie? Would you explain that one?
Well, I just thank God I had a pastor who saw something redeemable in me. Your guess is as good as mine. All I knew, I was assigned and allotted that responsibility, and I never will forget that day. At that time, preaching was not even near or close to my heart when that happened for you. But I never will forget that evening. We were in some back room praying and just asking God to give you the strength and the ability and the courage to be able to stand. But I think, I thank God for your dad and my mentor and your mentor who just would give us the opportunity. We was messing up some stuff, but he was giving us a chance to find ourselves and to grow, and just develop in that area of youth ministry. And those are some of the things that I think really impacted me, just being able to have that kind of opportunity at that particular time.
Yeah, and it just feels like kind of at that point going forward, our relationship started emerging. But we also were friends by compulsion. Your mother was my father's secretary.
Right.
And she basically just cared for me and helped raise me.
Right.
And if my father had somewhere to be that I couldn't go, he was dropping me off at your house. And when you walked out the door, your mom would be like, "Take him with you."
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So I mean, we were around each other a lot, and then we were with the old man a lot.
Right.
So it means we were around a lot of preaching.
Exactly.
And so there is this growing thing that I just saw God dealing in your life, and I remember the night in Texas,
Right.
where we had the conversation about a call to preach. But
Right.
what was going on leading up to when you were feeling this call to preaching in your life?
Well, I think for me, at that time, just my connection, my affiliation, in church life and being there, your dad, Dr. Charles, he was larger than life to me. So, I mean, it was kind of like I had no choice in some of the matters to go. So, especially when I got to the point where I learned how to drive. When I learned how to drive, it was kind of like, I need you to go over here and pick up some shoes, or I need you to go pick up a suit, or can you pick me up lunch? And I think with that, it just opened up a door of opportunity. Even before I was preaching, I was just exposed to a lot of preaching, and where I was able to sit and listen and hear different preachers, proclaim the gospel. Sure. And so as a result, I think the more I was around it and the more I saw it, the more God was kind of working in my heart and pulling me in that direction. And I think as God was doing it, it was not that I didn't initially talk to Dr. Charles about my call based on fear so much as it was just the reverence and the respect kind of what I had. But I never will forget, we would take those trips to Oklahoma when he would do revival, and I wasn't a preacher, so even then I was getting exposed to people like Dr. Ralph West and M.J. Williams and just other preachers. But one year when we were going, it was almost like a preaching tour for Doc and you. We'd stop in Texas and some preaching would get done there, and then it was almost like we was on the road. You preaching and get a little honorarium here, and then you head to Oklahoma, and then we come back. And I think then I was kind of wrestling with the call that God had on my life, and I never will forget, because of our relationship, we would primarily be together more so. And so I never will forget, we were in Dallas. I don't remember what hotel or what place that was. I just know we were by the pool one night. It was dark.
I can tell you that one thing I remember about that night. It was like whatever. It was like prom night.
Yeah.
And we like all these kids was coming to this hotel.
Yes, sir.
And we sat by the pool.
Yes,
Didn't want to
sir.
wake the old man up.
Yeah, and so we stayed out there. I never will forget that night till probably 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was there. You were the first person that I had opportunity to share with what I believed God was leading me to do. And after I had that conversation with you, you kind of served as a junior attorney and was like, look, we got to go talk to Dad about this. We got to go talk to Dad about this. And so we kind of went in together, and I was able to open up my heart to him, just along with you and your friendship and relationship, to be able to share with him, what I believe God was leading, calling me to do.
Sure. So, do you remember your first sermon?
My first sermon was Luke 9, 57 through 62. Are you a part-time Christian?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any record of it?
I do have a record of it. I've gone back and I've re-preached it, and I need to tell you it's 100% different.
I know that's right.
It's 100% different. I think, just that initial sermon, I think in most cases, that initial sermon is kind of more of your testimonial, you
Sure.
just kind of, testifying. But I think, with that, it was, and in that day, with HB Senior, it was a little different. I remember when I initially acknowledged my call to him, he was big on reading. You know by far, your dad had droves of books, and I remember the book that he gave me to read, and he was just giving me a forewarning that if you're going to be a preacher, you're going to have to read.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it. I appreciate it now when I look back. The first book he ever gave me to read was a sermon called The Broken Column by Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
Yeah.
And he said, you read this, and when I came back and told him I had read it, he said, well, you go back and you read it again. And I ended up having to read that 7 to 10 times, because his thing was, if you're going to be a preacher, you need to, you're going to have to be a reader.
Sure.
And so, as a result of that, it was just, and then with that, I got the opportunity to preach my first sermon, and you would have thought, I would have maybe been an evening service or a Wednesday night. He just threw me in the middle of the lake.
Sure.
Prime time, Sunday morning, 11 o'clock, and it's like sink or swim. And so, that began my journey.
So he was, he was always in the pulpit, but he was generous with the pulpit.
Exactly.
And particularly that second Sundays.
Exactly.
We were basically for a good period trading off.
Right.
The 8 and 11, and then this this just group of ever-growing group of young preachers started emerging. There were always a lot of preachers around him.
Right.
But then these just really young guys, Tracy and Barry and others, just started, and we just we really didn't. We'd be sitting in the choir stand.
Right.
Because the pulpit was full of preachers, and he had this Tuesday night meeting.
Yeah.
What night was it?
Monday night. Yes, sir.
Teachers meeting was on Monday.
Monday night, Tuesday night. Yeah,
Tuesday night.
Yeah, Tuesday night.
So just tell us, he had a weekly training.
Weekly
class.
training.
Mm-hmm.
Again, he was animate about us being developed as preachers, and I am literally, my ministry is indebted to him in that regard, because I think he shielded and protected us from a lot of landmines that we as young preachers could have gotten ourselves into. But I think one of the things was he wanted to be able to develop us, and one of those things was we weren't meeting once a month. He was really investing in us. This was a weekly. This was every week, and every week he wanted to know what you're working on, what you looking at, and the one thing you never wanted to hear him say was, "Son, do you want me to tell you what that text is saying?" Because if he said, "Son, Let me tell you what that text is saying. That meant that you had no clue of what that text meant. And so I think we were challenged to constantly always be working on something, always be developing something. And it was just through that he would disciple us. He would talk to us about the pros and cons. I never will forget there was a preacher, and I dare not name him, just protect him. And he had come to preach, and you probably remember the story. He preached, and I mean, he had this sensational close, and Jesus was up to bat. And he threw, the bases was loaded, and boy, I mean, young preachers typically wooing and oohing and on at it. And when we got to that Tuesday night class, the first question he asked was, well, what do you all think about that sermon on Sunday? And we got to chiming off, and he said sensationalism. As Dr. Wade would say, ecclesiastical rouseology. And he was just kind of challenging us even then to not get caught up in sensationalism, but to be committed to the seriousness of the scripture and how you handle the book, and don't get caught up in the moment of the people jumping and shouting and clapping. So I mean, just moments like that in that class were really, really what helped kind of keep me grounded.
Sure. I mean, not only did he allow us, first of all, just in general, he allowed us to be around him.
Right.
He's going somewhere to preach. He lets us sit and, we carrying his coat and briefcase into the room, and you get to sit in the corner and you hear these conversations. And then you have on top of that these Tuesday meetings where every week he's showing you, this is what I'm working on.
Right.
And then he's going to give something pastoral ethics, some tips.
Exactly.
And then he's going to make us go around the room. And man, that'd be a mad scramble. It's like homework. You're like finding the text or something. But he got you in the discipline of, there was very early on, we were still in our teens. There was our expectation that every week you ought to be working.
You ought to be working
on
something.
the text and working on the sermon.
Absolutely. And then not just that, but you're absolutely right. He afforded us, I mean, a lot of what I've learned from hospital visitation, from funerals. I mean, I can remember my training for funerals was always, look, get that Minister Star book, get 183, turn to that and read it. And I never will forget, we went to a funeral and we had gone for the interment, and there was another pastor who was going to be with the Lord, and he decided he was going to block Dr. Charles, and he went to him and basically said, "Oh man, I got it, you can stay here." And before you knew it, he said, "No, I got my boys with me." Sure. And it was just moments like that where it was, get the book, read this, to see him in the hospital where he didn't go and he didn't stay longer all day, but just long enough for the people to say, "Hey, Pastor, it's glad to see you." And just that quick, we were on our way, back out the door. So you're right, he was always giving us tips, and little did I pay attention to that at that time, that it was just stuff that was really helping and preparing me for whatever God was going to have for me in the future.
Sure. So there's a sense in which ministry is both taught and caught.
Right.
And then there's also this dynamic where Jesus is not setting the disciples in a classroom. They are with him.
With him.
And there is this dialogue associated to ministry that's happening alongside of life. And I mean, he would just let us be with him and then ask us afterward, what did you think about that?
Right.
Why did you think he did that? You sitting in meetings, you couldn't say nothing.
Right.
But he's going to ask, and then he answers in stuff you didn't even pay attention to. Exactly. So you're learning on the way in such a way that manner you didn't really know you were learning.
Right.
But you were learning by observation, by participation, and by evaluation.
Right.
And there is a sense in which I look at some younger preachers now who have this, I don't know what to call it, an independent streak.
Right.
Where they don't need the advice of the generation before, but we wouldn't be where we are. Our ministries are shaped by the wisdom of an older preacher. Right. Not just what he led us to, but like you said, there's some stuff we wanted to get involved in.
Right.
And he's like, no way, no how.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think just even with that, a lot of things that I learned even just about ministry. I mean, he was dapper in his dress. I mean, he probably cringe at some of the shirts we wear now.
Sure.
Because you just didn't wear a colored shirt. It was strictly white shirt, dark suit, and I can remember he always wanted us to look his best. I mean, I can remember times he'd take us to Frederick Lewis when it was in the Fox Hills Mall and get us a black suit, and then he'd see us on that Sunday and say, now you look like a preacher.
Yeah.
After, he had dressed us. I mean, just stuff he taught us. A gentleman wears one ring per finger, and, not loud suits and loud colors, because people are always looking for a reason to write you off and not listen to you. So even today, those things still stick in my, in my head, and it just has really helped me to avoid just a lot of things that I could have wound up in or done differently, or so I'm just I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, and it just, truth be told, I mean, I don't mind telling the truth. First of all, you were like a son to him, and then you were like the golden boy at the church.
I don't know about all that.
I mean, my name was Junior, but you actually listened to him. So he liked you better than he liked me. It's the truth. He listened. I was just, how many times y'all kept me out of trouble? Y'all Payne.
Yeah, a whole lot of times.
Y'all were keeping me out of trouble because I was a know-it-all young preacher. And boy, I'd get him riled up, man.
Yeah, I know.
And I mean, y'all would listen and do exactly what he said. And I'm like, why can't I do it this way? I'm gonna tell you the other big thing that just really, really ticked him off. He could, but he wasn't big on this hooping stuff. No. And he thought a lot of that stuff was sensationalism.
Yeah.
This is like the death kill for him, this sensationalism. And I was determined. And he couldn't. And I mean, boy, but I'm glad that he would just kept warning us, don't be a stereotype.
Right.
Be a preacher that your preacher can stand, anywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah. So at a certain point, you head off to school. Tell us about that process.
I acknowledged my call to preach in 1987, and preached my first sermon. Within about a year later, we had a discussion. Dr. Charles was adamant that the church was becoming more educated, and because the church was becoming more educated, then you as a preacher needed to seek to become a little bit more educated. He had this saying, and we know it well because we were raised up and brought up around him. He would always tell us that school is not for everybody. But what school does is it polishes or it shines up your shoes.
Sure.
And you can wear your suit with your shoes unpolished, but think about how much better your suit looks if your shoes are polished. So that was kind of his push for me. When we were pushing at that, Bishop was kind of in a lot of trouble. And so that was really what we had our radar set on. But with the state of it, he recommended that we not go there based on some inroads and some advice that he had. So the option was really to just push to get into school for that fall. And so we wound up landing on a Methodist school called Wiley, which has now been kind of relifted to some status after the movie The Great Debaters. And so we picked that school for me to attend. It was not a school that per se had a seminary in it. It was more of a school that had a school of religion in it. So I didn't get a lot of the mechanics about preaching. It was more like, world religion and philosophy and some other things. So I attended there for a year. And after I had come back from that first year of school, Doc was sick then. And it was during that period that I returned that, the Lord called him home. And then as a result of that, I decided that I was not going to return back to Wiley, but I would continue to pursue my education locally. And so I went to Western Theological Seminary, where I ended up finishing and getting a bachelor in theology.
So you come back, this period of sickness was brief.
Right.
Not a long stretch.
No.
And I mean, I think by the time the church really got a sense that something was really, really serious,
Right.
he was gone.
Gone.
And so, people have heard me talk about me flying home that day. My dad died. You're the one to pick me up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you're trying to get me there without telling me what was
Right.
happening.
Right.
And I mean, we all in our 40s now. We were teenagers then, but that's still like a big day.
Right.
And,
It was indeed, and that was just a kind of a weird and difficult time. During that time, I know we had gone back conversationally, and it wasn't just you and Doc, but I was privileged to be in that, because at that time you were trying to get out of going to do revival, and he was animate about you going on and taking that revival in Detroit. And at the same time you were going to Detroit, we were having our own revival
Right.
at the church, and he was animate about that going on. Dr. Reed was doing our revival, and you were going to Detroit, and Doc was
So John, for people that don't know, John Reed, Jr., pastor of the Fairview Baptist Church, one of the vice presidents of the National Baptist Convention, they were very close friends.
very, very close
And
friends.
we had one revival. He didn't even call it revival.
Yeah.
He called it homecoming.
Homecoming.
But it was no question who was going to preach
Who
that.
was going to preach it?
And he was just not only he was Uncle John to us then.
Right.
He just kind of adopted us as son. He's pops to
Right.
us now. But even that was providential. I mean, I really think it was providential that I was not there and didn't see those final days of decline.
Right.
And it really was providential that Dr. Reed was there that week.
Right. Right.
Because he really was a friend in those next transitional moments.
Indeed he was.
For the church.
Indeed he was. And he was conducting the revival. He finished the revival on that Friday night, came by the house, spoke with Doc, because Doc didn't make it to any of those meetings that week. He was just so sick he could not. And I ended up staying the night there that Friday night, and that next morning it was my charge to get you from the airport, but not to divulge to you the severity of what was going on, just to get you to the house. And when you got there, I'm trying to throw off 1,000 questions. You hollering about your bag.
My bag. I wanted something to eat, and you trying.
I said, "Look, man,
why can't I get my bag, man?" Right.
Yeah. We have no time for bag. We have no time for food.
Sure.
And then I think during that time, I found out. I don't remember whether I stopped to call before I got you or what the case was, but it was like they've taken him to the hospital. He's not at the house, and that was at Midway on San Vicente. And so we're racing, and I'm breaking the law and speeding and trying to get there. And we got there. I never will forget, they said, "Hold on, let me get somebody to talk to you." And you still were kind of confused about what was going on. And I knew then when they told me that I didn't want you to hear it from them. And so we got in the car, and by the time we got to the house, the handwriting was on the wall, because it was so many of the leaders and the people that had already assembled.
The house was crowded.
And gathered to the house. And so, that was a huge moment.
Man, I think I sat in the car with my luggage for a few hours.
Yeah.
You done went down the street and sat on the car.
Yeah.
It was just a
Yeah.
real weird experience.
Yeah.
And so it's just like our world just shifted.
It did.
The church had been with a pastor for 40 years. He was the second pastor.
Yeah.
And there's this long stretch
Right.
where there is this beauty pageant of preachers that's coming through.
Right.
But somehow we still keep getting a whole bunch of opportunities.
Yeah, we still do.
to preach.
We did, and that's just the providence of God. I can remember it had even got to a point when we were going out. If it was supposed to be somebody to preach, it was either you or it was me.
Yeah.
In some, just in some instances, and those were some trying, difficult, years, but God sustained us, I think, through that. And I thank God, that we didn't lose our passion or our commitment, in those couple of years that went by.
We didn't know what was going to happen at the church.
No.
But we were going to be preaching, whatever. We were preaching, we were listening to preachers.
Right.
Unless we was preaching, we were still sitting in the choir, staying off in the corner.
Yeah.
All the preachers that my dad had, so many of them were still around.
Right.
But in a strange way, some of those dynamics just accelerated our growth.
It did.
Opportunities.
Yeah, it did. And there's some things I got to say sorry to the Lord for, because I know it was some fellas who called themselves coming and thinking they were going to turn in some paperwork, and they greeted us on the way out, and that paperwork never made it to the office.
Man, listen, there's one dude, man, gave me his resume at the old man's funeral.
Oh yeah,
he gave me his resume.
Oh man, some of these fellas, wow.
It was, them dudes,
unbelievable.
And a lot of those Sundays, we were out because I was preaching somewhere,
right,
too, and then we'd come back and get these reports and it was 18 months of just, it was weird.
It was. But even through that, God sustained, and primarily, he even at a young age, he just kept you moving and going and preaching. I used to tease everybody and say my Jeep went to church more than some of the members.
Yeah. Let me tell you something, man. That Suzuki Samurai, man, was all over that town, man, with us in church, man. We wore that car down.
Oh, man, we did.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So they wind this thing down. They get ready to vote. We sitting in the back of the church that night, and they end up calling me that night, and we just kind of went to get eggs that night.
Yeah.
And then, not really fully processing what was going on, but it just kind of, it's another shift, and we just kind of keep plunging in further now. We went from the fringes, except when we were preaching, to kind of being a more central role. And really those years you were just there alongside of me, serving. And at a certain point, we turning over the 8 o'clock service to you. But that didn't last very long.
No, it didn't last long.
In the midst of this, we were just kind of working together so much at that point. We had the 2 morning services and turning over the 8 o'clock service to you, to the preaching. You had started 1 or 2 Corinthians?
1 Corinthians.
You didn't get, how far you get? About a month?
Maybe about a month, about to put the brother out, I think is where I jumped out at.
So, you end up getting called to the church that you have now served for 22 years.
Yes.
How did that church find you? How did you find the church?
Let me just kind of rewind and go back, if I can just address that, that night that you were called. We were literally on that back row, literally holding hands and praying, because when we initially came, man had said that you wouldn't get that church.
Sure.
And God had otherwise, and I will forget. Yes,
but we went there.
Yeah, we went there for that. Yeah.
I wasn't even on the ballot.
No, you wasn't even on the ballot. We went there that night to, under our assumption, to elect the next pastor.
Sure.
And I will forget that Bro Wilkes. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. He stood up and said, "I want to nominate," and he nominated you. And little did we know that night we would be leaving the church with you, as our new pastor. And that was just a joy for us. And Norm's at that time was our hangout. So we went to grab something to eat. And so from there I had the privilege, and I want to just kind of pause before I get into that and just say, there have been, many people who've had an influence on my ministry and my life. Your dad, number one, Dr. Reed, who we call Pop affectionately, and and without question, you have had a major influence on my ministry. I think about stuff like, just.
Yeah.
Nights in those basements.
Yeah.
Where a lot of these guys, they got your new book, and I want to celebrate you about that on preaching, but
Yeah.
I had a class on preaching
Sure.
long before that book
Yeah.
was printed. I mean, it was nights we would have to spend in that basement, man, and we'd start at 7 o'clock, and we'd have to, talk about what we were preaching, and sometimes it was a battle royal. All the guys didn't fully understand.
Sure.
I think what you were trying to do, so your love for preachers and development didn't just start. I mean, you've had that from the beginning of your ministry, and so that really is what helped me. It was like you used to teach us, if I'm putting out a sermon every week, the least you can do is have a sermon ready once a month.
Sure.
And that kind of was my motivation to just be ready, be prepared. I didn't know when my pastor was going to need me. I didn't know when he was going to be tired. I didn't know when he was going to say, I just don't have it to do. So my thing was, those things were a major influence that helped me, to kind of get where I am. And I never will forget, to just kind of answer your question, with Full Gospel, we were all sitting at the prayer bowl at Mount Moriah. And we were sitting in the back, and at that time, Full Gospel did not have a pastor. Pastor Higgins, who was the brother of a long-standing president of our conference, 20 plus years, Frank Higgins was the pastor of Full Gospel, and Pastor Jupiter, who's gone on to be with the Lord now, was kind of helping oversee that church. And so at that time, we were in the back, and it was, I believe, me and Wilson and Barry Wilson, Tracy Johnson, and it might have been Fred Steen, and he wanted to know, was it okay for him to get our number, because he was trying to help them to supply some preachers over at the church. And so he got our numbers, and then they invited me, to come over one Sunday and preach, and that was kind of the providence of God, because that particular church you had done revival in. I never will forget, I wasn't a singer, and one night you had me to lead a song.
Yeah.
Over at Full Gospel, and never did I think, even when we were going there for revival, that I would end up being the pastor of this church that pastor's doing revival in. But such is the providence of God. And so,
wow.
As a result, some time went by, and I think there was some space, because Pastor Higgins passed in September of 1992, and they called me as pastor in July of 1993. And so even though I preached at the beginning part of the year, it was kind of, some space that kind of had gone through there, and I really didn't know what decision they were going to make, and what they were going to do. And I never will forget the night that they made a decision to call me. You had just finished preaching an evening service at United Christian, Pastor Leroy Haley. And when I got home, they had been trying to contact me, and I couldn't reach you that Sunday night, and we had morning prayer. And that's when I think at that time you had got that first dog that got too big for you. You got a dog you thought was going to stay little, and it was a German Shepherd. And we met that morning, and I was able to kind of share with you that they had made a decision, and we talked about what my response was going to be to that, and kind of just the transition. And so.
And I don't mean to skip parts. As you're talking, it's just stuff coming to my mind. The weird part of this, like I said, what makes this interview so weird is that so much of our early story is just kind of interwoven.
Right.
Another part that we just skipped, I'm going to get back to the church. Another part that we skipped is I get called to Mount Sinai, and 17. 4 or 5 months later, I turned 18. We are together on my birthday.
Right.
We're on Culver City area, stopping in and out.
Yep.
And by the end of that week, I had to find a place to live.
Right.
And
Right.
all I remember was we had driven down that street.
Right.
And so I went back to that street, and that's where I ended up staying. And I was just like, hey, man, I'm like, just turned 18. I can't live by myself, man.
Right.
So we ended up, how long did we live together?
About 2 years.
Yeah.
About 2 years we were roommates, and boy, I got some stuff on.
No. Yeah, man.
Yeah, but 2 years, and even during that period in time, you were not even, weren't officially driving, didn't have a driver's license.
I was riding in your Suzuki.
In fact, and I think you learned how to drive. I had a rental car, and I took a huge risk. And we were just you were learning how to drive. And again, I was there with you, a couple of years until you felt, comfortable enough to be on your own. And once you got your legs up under you, I got on out of there.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
Wow.
But we had an opportunity. We were just together.
Right.
A lot. It's one thing to have been in the meetings, in the services, and et cetera. But then we was coming back, and still those conversations kept going.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we were learning a lot. And then you started at full gospel.
Yeah.
And one of the things is, I would also say is just, God honored your faithfulness. I was always pressing about the guys. To this day, if any of the pastors, associate ministers of this church, watch this, they're gonna freak out, because every time we meet, I'm asking I need manuscripts. I need manuscripts.
Right.
I'm preaching every week. Y'all can give me a manuscript once a month. I mean, I'm still these years later, but not everybody did that.
Right.
And you did. And I mean, the church started calling you Ready Reggie,
Right.
which was just a huge compliment. And probably back then, I had already started traveling a lot, which got me in some trouble. But one of the things that helped me get away with being gone as much as I was gone was that you were ready to preach, and I really think God honored that in the next steps of ministry.
Right. And I just think that, and again, it goes back again to just you challenging us and just wanting, to be better.
Sure.
To be better as a preacher. I never will forget when you created an office space for me, and we were trying to transition about me coming on full-time staff before I left. I never will forget you had come back from Detroit, and you just passed by the office, and with just casual conversation, it's like, what you been working on? And I said, well, I'm working on a dramatic monologue. And you said, well, what you been working on a monologue? He said, I tell you what, let's do a monologue together for Easter. You do 8 o'clock, and I'll do 11 o'clock. And I will forget, I did a monologue on Pontius Pilate, and you did a monologue on Peter at 11 o'clock. But it was just those moments of trying to prepare, because you never knew. And some of the guys didn't like that. I know we had a couple of guys, I ain't gonna call their name, but they was like, I need 2 weeks notice. I need 3 weeks notice before I could preach. And it would be sometimes we'd be in that circle, and you'd be like, bless Reggie, Lord, he got to bring the message this morning.
Yeah.
So I mean,
I just got off a plane, and we praying going into the service, and Lord, we praying that you use Reggie this morning. And
exactly. And you never know. And I even recall one time you had come back from Detroit, and you had an issue. It was Easter Sunday.
Oh.
And you, Ruth had to take you to the hospital.
Wait, we had like sunrise and the 2 morning services.
Sunrise and 2 morning
services. And I was
services.
sick, and I was determined to preach anyway.
Yeah.
And I only made it through one service.
You did. We had done sunrise. You came back, and by the grace of God, you did 11 o'clock. I don't know how you did it to this day. I don't know if it was the medication or if it was Jesus. But you were on your way out the door, and you was like, look, Reggie, you got to preach. And so on the way out, no associate expects on Easter Sunday
morning
you're going to get the call out the bullpen to preach.
Right.
But I had to, by the grace of God, because you always told us, look, be working on something. Always be working on something. I was able to go in the room and pray and gather my thoughts and, and be able to get up and stand.
Praise God.
Yeah.
Praise God. So I know you get this question a lot. I won't ask it. I'll just tell you, say it for you.
Okay.
That Full Gospel Church is not affiliated with the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship.
No.
This was a church that was named such long before there was a Full Gospel.
Yes, sir.
You took this church. It had a faithful pastor in Higgins who had also been sick for a while. He had pastored the church from a wheelchair at a certain point.
Yes.
And that was a stretch.
Yeah.
So just what is this process where we had been kind of in a safe haven under the old man.
Right.
We just kind of was having a great revival while you were with me under my pastorate.
Right.
You left and all hell broke loose. It was like the rapture. The Lord got you out of there. The Lord got you out of there, Doc, and then that thing got bad for me. Ooh. But you had those kind of a nurturing environment. Yeah. So now you are in a lot of ways starting from scratch.
Right.
So just what is this like? And many times a young preacher is not going to. My situation is an anomaly. Right. You can go to seminary and be trained, and you're not going to start at a church like Maxani I was.
Right. You're
going to start somewhere small.
Right.
And you're going to have to build a work.
Right.
What was that process like for you?
It was initially it was a difficult transition for me. We often laugh about it at Full Gospel now, and just to go back, the church Full Gospel is this year will celebrate 54 years of ministry, and I struggled with that because right when I got called to the church, the Full Gospel Fellowship was just being started, and so one of the things was I was always asked the question, "Are you the Full Gospel with Morton?" And so at that time, I had finished at Western Theological, and I was going to California Graduate School, and I had a professor, and I was kind of sharing with him some of the struggles I was having, and his response to me was, don't change the name of the church because that's to take away from the history and the heritage. Why not just run your distinctives and what you believe in your worship guide, so that when people come, they don't have to ask you, they'll be able to read and see what you believe. So that's what we did to kind of counteract that, and then it just kind of gave people, if you think that's what it is, it's not, because here's what we stand for and we represent. And so it was a transition for me. We laugh about it jokingly. I tell my church family all the time that I was in a place that the hotbed of revival was going on. Mount Sinai was Jerusalem for me at that time. And God was moving, and then he treated me like Philip and said, I want you to go out here to the Gaza Strip. And I teased and tell him that, for me at that time, Full Gospel was that Gaza Strip. I mean, I was transitioning from a church where the membership was growing, the people were coming, ministry was happening. I had my own office. I had accessibility to a secretary. The church was moving to make me a paid staff person. Now I'm going to a church that really can't pay me a salary. I'm going to a church where I have no secretary. I'm the pastor, the secretary, I'm everything. The membership was fledgling. I probably had more people in the teachers meeting class that I was teaching at that time than I had in the church, but I just felt that this was a place that God had opened the door for me and was leading me to go. And so I went on and took the assignment and began to just try to work what I believe God wanted me to do.
Praise God.
Yeah.
Praise God. What were the turning points where you felt like the thing is turning into your hands and God is moving the church forward?
I think I never really never felt like that from the beginning. I think when I got there, the church was really embracive of wanting to progress and move forward. I kind of tell people, even though it was an established church for me, it was kind of like I was organizing the church, because I think I might have had one, maybe two deacons. I had two deacons, and one of them had just acknowledged his call to preach. And, I didn't have a lot of bureaucracy, and there were not a lot of members there that I had to contend or deal with. So a lot of stuff was kind of more, before you make changes, you teach change. You teach it, you talk it. You don't just go in and then just change something, and you haven't taught it, you haven't tried to teach it.
Sure.
To the people. And so I think for me with that, some things began to transition. Naturally, there was always the issues of the financial piece. The church is 54 years old, but in the 54 years, I'm the first salaried pastor that they've had there. They kind of had a system of third Sunday was pastor's love offering, but I realized, early on, look, we not raising enough money to go to the bank 3 times a month. We need to be at the bank every week. And so we kind of shifted in that regard. And it was just, those were some difficult times for me. I tell guys, you got to know what you called to. You got to be faithful to that. You got to trust God. I mean, it was some weeks I would just be praying, please don't let nobody call me for no fellowship. Because it wasn't that I didn't want the fellowship. I didn't have a check to take to the fellowship, and then, it was just a sense of pride about us. And, and so for me, I think with that, the church was always really embracive and supportive. One of the things I probably can I won't say pride myself in, but that I've never experienced. I've not once in 22 years had a blow up at a meeting. The church has been pretty much a supportive church, and whatever I felt God was leading us to do, they've rallied behind that. Some of my fellow colleagues say, you need a challenge, because you've been there 22 years and you haven't really had, any kind of conflict or challenge. And I just attribute that to, just the goodness of the Lord.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I always say, I would say to young pastors and preachers back in the day who would point to you, and what God was doing at the church, that really this was a work of God. Because you can go into a small church and there be a key family there,
right,
or a longtime leader there.
Right.
The church doesn't have to be strong. It
Exactly.
could just have this roadblock.
Right.
And sometimes it could be a very small church, but it's just this is our church and we're not changing.
Exactly.
And we was here before you got here, and we'll be here when you're gone.
Right.
But in your situation, it's as if the Lord just turned their hearts towards you,
right,
and they were willing to follow leadership.
They were, and I never forget, there are two ladies dear, Mary Benson, who's going on to be with the Lord, and Katie Nixon. And they were two women who made it publicly known we did not vote for you. Because at that time I was 25, I was single, I wasn't married, and all they could think of was, we don't want a scandal in our church.
Sure.
And they didn't vote for me. But before the Lord took them home, they were two of my strongest supporters. One of them rallied and challenged the church to make sure that they sent me to the Holy Land. Another one just was so connected that when she passed away, she left a piece of property to me and my family. I mean, it was just the people who I thought would not give me the support I needed just kind of turned, the corner along with the rest. And you're absolutely right. It's been a nothing but a work of God. People ask me, what's your story? And I just tell them it's God. I don't have a story. I can't go back and say I did A, B, C, D, E. I just, it's been God every step of the way.
And I think, man, this is why you go into a church, you pray, you preach as hard as you can,
Right.
you love the people.
Exactly.
You become the chief historian to learn the story of the church.
Right.
You need to get a sense of what it is before you start putting your hands on stuff. And the other thing I would just add is that you got to guard your heart against premature conclusions.
Right.
Because oftentimes the people who are all in your face when you show up don't be the people that end up sticking it out.
Exactly.
And like you said, sometimes the people who you would have never thought, you get there and you say, oh, they're going to be a problem. And those end up being the people God brings alongside of you that you would have never.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So my father was a heavy influence on us both in preaching. But we pretty much knew very early on we could not preach like him.
Right.
He's not a classical musician. He's a jazz musician.
Right.
And there, it was just, he didn't do it by the numbers.
Right.
He just and he was one of those, he was of that generation of the classic kind of orator preachers.
Right.
Gardner Taylor, D.E. King, Manuel Scott, along that kind of, Sandy Ray. Then his homiletical hero, was Charles Spurgeon. He's every week reading Charles Spurgeon, and I think it influenced the way he thought about text, how he thought about preaching. But even though he was not in the sense of an expositor that we would call, he had a great influence on us.
Excellent.
There were a lot of similarities between the old man and Pastor Reed. Pastor Reed was gonna shut that thing down.
Yeah, he was gonna shut it down. Oh yeah.
That was the one time a year we were gonna definitely hear hooping.
Yes, sir.
But there was very similar. They were manuscript preachers.
Yes.
And then you're spending those early years with me, where I am trying to learn expository preaching.
Right.
Trying to help as I'm learning. Trying to share what I'm learning.
Right.
Those are early years. So when you leave at 25, I'm 20.
Right.
So these 19, 20, somewhere around now.
Right.
So these are early stages of the process for me.
Right.
These are influences on you, but along the journey of preaching, especially now when you have the weekly responsibility of being the primary preacher and nurturing a church. What were the influences on you, other influences on you and your preaching?
Well, I think one was, for at least the 2 years that I did have there, seeing you put it together and seeing you do it. And then always connected with you, we were always trying to expose ourselves to other preachers, whether it was, exposition or textual, because at the end of the day, you become a better preacher by preaching.
Sure.
And I think we made it our business when we knew it was good preaching in town to connect with that. A couple of examples, I know we used to go, I remember the first time we heard Dr. Caesar Clark, he preached at the conference, and we violated all rules of protocol that night. We went to Paradise and we was in the pulpit just to be able to touch his coat.
Yeah.
But I think, just that was a motivation.
And if somebody tried to pull that stuff with us, man, we would just go ballistic. But we didn't even know better. We just heard him at the conference that day, and we just showed up early and just took seats in the pulpit.
Took seats in the pulpit. We wanted to make sure we got to hear him.
Yeah.
But that, and then I think probably one of the turning points for me was in the same setting as you, and that was when we went to Mount Moriah to hear E.K. Bailey.
Yeah.
And I never will forget
So may I set this up a little bit?
Uh-huh.
So we're having our first revival under my pastorate.
Right.
Jerome Kirby.
Right.
Who has gone on to be with the Lord.
Right.
And he's, mind you were driving, I still couldn't drive.
Right.
And we stopped to get him some chicken before we took him in.
Right.
And he's like, I want y'all to take me to hear E.K. Bailey.
Yeah, we like E.K. Bailey. Who's E.K. Bailey?
Yeah, and he was like, don't tell nobody else that.
Yeah.
And we heard him that first day.
Yeah.
And it was like, golly.
In fact, we didn't stop there. I think that week we heard him, because I never will forget the memorable sermon he preached, the lessons at AI.
Yeah. Reclaiming lost ground.
And I mean, when I heard him and how simple he made it, I said, that's the way preaching ought to be. Ought to be done.
Yeah.
And from there, I just, began to try to position, myself even further, even though I was getting an example of it in you every week when you were doing it. But then when I got on my own, it was kind of like I had nobody but me to keep me on that line. And I think that becomes the temptation, I think, for a lot of guys, is, quote unquote, we say, when you had a Sanhedrin before you, you gotta stay on course and on target. And then sometimes there's that temptation when you don't have, so you feel that audience to kind of give way, but I was kind of committed to wanting to do that. So it, for me, it wasn't just there. A lot of it I had to find in books. I mean, Jerry Vines was just an absolute godsend to me. The preparation book and the delivery book, and then MacArthur comes along with expository preaching, and Olford comes along with anointed expository preaching. So it's almost like you have no excuse not to learn how to become an expositor with all these people putting this stuff in print for you to read about it.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. So what has been your preaching practice? You had started with me before you left. You were starting 1 Corinthians. Did you pick up the practice of preaching books or series? What has been your preaching practice over these 22 years?
Over these 22 years, it has been the practice of preaching through books. I think that's what helps a congregation grow at a steady pace, and it gives them a good diet, to eat from and to feed from. And then it doesn't just keep you all over. The struggle is, after a Sunday, what am I going to preach next week? And when you have that issue where you're struggling yourself, to know where to preach. And I would just give, if I had to give any advice to any young preacher that was listening to us, is that, Bill Bennett has a book called, that I read many years ago, called 30 Minutes to Raise the Dead. And his point is you don't study the Bible for sermons. You study it for your spiritual growth, and God will give you sermons out of that. And so I think that, for me, it's been an issue of studying the scripture, and then once I get through reading it, I can determine what I think will help the church that I shepherd. And so for me, it has been series. I'm presently now, I just launched 2 weeks ago. I'm preaching through 2 Peter, and it's wearing me down to the ground. But I'm doing that, and I try to do, if I'm doing a series on a Sunday, and I've adopted this of ladder from Dr. Joel Gregory, that, I try to do something different than a series on Wednesday. And so if I'm doing a book on Wednesday, I try to do something, different on Sunday. But for the most part, I'm going to be in a book, whether it's Wednesday or Sunday. I'm going to be in a book, and I'm going to try to finish that book.
Sure.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that was just beneficial in terms of preaching for us, I don't know if it's the same norm, but we were so passionate about preaching. You mentioned the Caesar Clark thing. We had the ACC, and I mean, it'd be all kinds of revivals happening at the same time. So you just gotta pick your poison. Monday night we're going to hear him. Tuesday night we're going across town to hear him. And just hearing, if you are only hearing one preacher, you are going to fall into this imitation thing.
Right.
But if you are listening to multiple preachers and you're getting strengths,
right,
even if they're not the same style, this helps if they're not the same style.
Right.
And we were doing that. We were hearing all kinds of great preachers. And the crazy part about it is in LA that, a lot of times half them revivals happening in the week would be from somebody preaching in town.
Right.
Who lived in town.
Right.
It was strong.
Right.
Strong. Preachers. When we were coming up, it was just a heyday of preaching.
Right.
Right there.
It was, and it was always somebody in town, and we were always piling up. It could be Donald Parsons, it could be Jasper Williams, it could be L.K. Curry. It didn't matter who it was. We were trying to go hear him. And then, I mean, it's even with that, I can remember it was, I think about all the years I was in L.A. before I even knew who R.A. Williams was. And he was almost on the doorstep.
You down the street from
Yeah,
him.
and never knew who he was until you get exposed to him, in expository preaching conference. And and even with that, I rode that for, I know, at least 8 to 10 years that I just constantly went to that just to, try to develop myself as far as exposition was, concerned.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. That's great. So the church has grown over these years. The last few years, the church has relocated.
Yes.
Then you have another dynamic. You were serving as the interim pastor of the church as they were seeking a pastor.
All right.
And you helped them find a pastor. Who did they find?
They end up finding me. And that's a situation that was naturally unexpected. Weren't looking for it. We had not long relocated our facility, and the church is growing in just the work itself. And I had been serving for about a year as interim pastor with the understanding that I would become the interim if within 90 days they would start the process of trying to find their next pastor. And they did seek to do that. And maybe about 9 months in, I went out of town. And when I came back, they had a meeting, and the meeting kind of was like, well, you've been here and you've been doing this and the other church. Why can't you stay on and continue to be the pastor? Well, at that time, I didn't want to compromise or undermine my leadership at Full Gospel. I had been there, at that time at almost 18 years. So I had to call a church meeting. I met with the leaders first and to kind of convey to them what potentially had been presented to me. I didn't know what the outcome was, but I wanted them to be aware of it before it happened. The leaders were kind of supportive and embracive. They kind of looked at it, the fact, because prior to our relocation, we had been doing 2 morning services anyway, and they kind of looked at it like, you're accustomed to doing 2 sermons. We think you'll be able to do it. We'll step up our game here to make sure it happens if that's what the Lord's will is. And so I never will forget that they said, we want to make sure we get full support from the church at this meeting. We don't want it to be half attended. So they ran an announcement and said, we want you to come on this night. It concerns the future of our pastor. And they left it just like that. And folk was out the woodworks. They didn't want to know, what you mean, the future of our pastor.
Yeah.
So the church is packed, and we talk about the opportunity that God is potentially maybe presenting to us, and and so the church is kind of 100% embracive of that. And True Samaritan later on makes their decision, and then they call me to lead that church unanimously. And I've been there now going on 3 years.
So what has this been like, pastoring 2 churches? How far are the churches away from each other?
The churches are probably about 10 to 15 minute drive from where we're located. Full Gospel has a morning service, and Full Gospel does not have church school or Sunday school on Sunday, but we do know the significance of a Christian education piece of making a strong church. And so what we've chosen to do is we put all our energy on Wednesday, and we basically give classes for all ages on Wednesday, which helps facilitate our growth as far as the Christian education aspect of the church. And so we primarily are only doing a morning worship there on Sundays. True Samaritan is more of a traditional context, if you will, where they have Sunday school that precedes the morning worship, which starts at 9:30, and then they have 11 o'clock worship. So I pretty much do the morning service at Full Gospel, which runs to about 10:45, at the latest 11. And then I leave from Full Gospel, and then I head to True Samaritan for their 11 o'clock worship.
So this is not what you would call one church in 2 locations. These are 2 independent congregations.
2 independent, separate congregations, 2 deacon boards, 2 trustee boards. It's 2 separate congregations. One of the fortunate things that enables me, because a lot of people say, how do you do it? One, I preach the same sermon right now at both locations. There's no sense in me trying to reinvent the wheel and preach one thing here and one thing there. I get the same sermon I teach, True Samaritan, they probably get the better sermon.
Sure.
Because by that time I'm thinking about on the commute there what I should have did that morning and what I could have said and what I probably should have left out. So I get a minute to tweak that sermon. And so I always tease them and say, you all get the better sermon, because I already got the practice in at full gospel on the first sermon.
Sure.
So I do that, and I'm able to go there. True Samaritan was a church that I'm the fourth pastor in its history. It's 59 years old. We just celebrated that last Sunday, 59 years. And I'm the fourth pastor. The first pastor, Pastor Hopkins, pastored there 30 and a half years. Pastor Bell pastored there 20 and a half years. And then there was a pastor there, Pastor Johnson, A.E., who pastored about 15 months. And I since have been there. They were a church that were taught and trained, developed to take the load off of the pastor, to give him time to focus on nothing but the primary teaching and preaching of the gospel. So that was an absolute breath of fresh air for me, because that's my primary responsibility and focus. There's staff there that does the visitation, that does the communion, that does the counseling if need be. So my primary thing is just the preaching and teaching, and that's how I'm able to kind of, accomplish it and do it.
So do they have a midweek schedule?
Midweek schedule, they don't. They have, because they're older congregation and a lot of them are commuter. They're literally some members of that church who live an hour to an hour and 15 minutes away. The primary focus of what they do is there's a Celebrate Recovery class that takes place during the week. We have a food outreach ministry that goes during the week. But the primary focus of what goes on is on the weekends. We have evangelism training on Saturday, choir rehearsal for whatever group is on a Saturday, Sunday school is on Sunday, worship is on Sunday, and even the pastor that was there 20 and a half years, he lived about an hour away. And so his thing was, I'm not going to drive an hour and something in and then you all not show up to Bible study. So they even have Bible study after worship has concluded. They take a break, and then there's maybe 40 people who stay for study of scripture.
You teach that?
I teach it some weeks, not every not every week.
Sure,
But I have a team teacher who teaches with me. I write the curriculum, I give it to them, and then I let them know early on in the week I'm not going to be able to do that on Sunday, and then they take the responsibility and they cover the class.
Wow, That is great. That is great. Do the congregations ever come together for any event? Yeah,
they come together. In fact, we're working on now, we come together for sunrise. We do a joint combined sunrise service at 6:30. We alternate that from facility to facility. So this year we'll have sunrise at True Samaritan, and then we have 9 at Full Gospel, and then we go back to True Samaritan for 11 o'clock worship. And then there are other times throughout the year, National Day of Prayer, we come together. If we're doing revival, we merge everybody together and come together. And then we take the calendars, we mesh them together. So whenever there's something, True Samaritan literally announces everything Full Gospel does, and vice versa. That way, if somebody misses something in the morning at Full Gospel and wants to pick up a worship opportunity later on in that day, then they have that opportunity to do it.
Wow, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. So we could just tell a whole lot more stories.
Yeah.
But it's just great to have this conversation, and I'm just excited about all the Lord is doing. If I could circle back, you have been married for how long now?
I've been married. I just celebrated 19 years.
This is you know what this means? It means we're old, man. This is what this means, right? Yeah. And you and Deborah both grew up.
I tell people all the time, Mount Sinai was a good church for me. I met Christ in that church. I got baptized, acknowledged my call in that church. Met my wife in that church.
Yes, sir.
That was a great church for me.
Amen.
Yeah.
19 years.
Yeah.
You have a daughter.
Have a daughter who's 14 years old. And she's got us going. She's a rugby player, so she's doing this rugby thing. Her mom's not enthused, but she's growing up in Christ and finding her own identity in her own place. So we praise God for that.
Yeah. Praise God. Well, man, I just I just praise God for the all that I see him doing in your work, and so much of the things, what we didn't mention, it's like the year the old man passed, he like named you like special assistant. What did that mean?
Yeah, I was. He named me special assistant to the pastor, and
I'm telling you, he had great hopes for you.
Yeah,
he did. I was incorrigible, but he had hopes for you, Reggie.
He did. He was rooting for me. Maybe he knew something nobody else knew, and he did that. And I one of the things that I'm grateful for and thankful to God for is that I learned a lot with him, and I'm really concerned even about staff, associates, and ministers now who feel like we owe them a platform to highlight and showcase their ministry. And I just got joy out of just driving my pastor, picking his clothes up from the cleaners, going to pick up a suit or shoes, and he could call me to go get soul food that was around the corner from him. Sure. It'd be some days he'd call me and say, go get my plate from Bertha's, and I'd be like, Bertha's is right around the corner from him. But I never grumbled and said that, and I never knew that even in that God was using him to bless me, because it would be times I didn't have gas money, and just going to get Bertha's, when I come back he'd say, here, go fill your tank up on your car.
Oh, wow.
And I just didn't, and so for me, I did it because I loved him, and I wanted to do whatever I could, to kind of be there for him.
And if someone would have said to us the term armor bearer, we wouldn't have known what in the world they were talking about.
No, we wouldn't.
This was not about title and celebrityism and all of those things. It was just the disciple mentor kind of relationships, and it feels like you're serving, but you benefit by that service.
Right.
Your God is blessing you as you serve and for the privilege.
Right.
Right.
And I think that the key to that a lot of guys miss is that in order to be mentored, you got to make yourself available.
Sure.
And a lot of guys don't make themselves available for the process of being mentored. He never had to ask me, and you never had to ask me, well, where's Reggie at? Why is he, not here? We didn't take a preaching assignment unless it was cleared. We didn't just go and say, I'm not going to be here Sunday, I'm preaching out. No, we would go and say, hey, look, I've been contacted to preach. Pastor, is it okay for me to take this assignment? Do you need me to do anything, this morning? I think because we were constantly there available, because to be mentored and wanted to be mentored and wanted, to be poured into. But now, it's.
But there's a whole different thing, because under the old man, and even with your ministry under me, you were associated with me, where you couldn't just, if you just left and showed up at another church, the pastor would be like, wait a minute.
Right. What you doing?
And he's gonna call.
Right.
That day is gone.
Right.
And sometimes we are more opportunistic as pastors and don't pay that respect. And then sometimes the associate ministers are just church hopping.
Right.
Or whatever seems to be the hottest thing and the best opportunity. But if you don't get your roots down somewhere, you're not going to grow.
Right. Yeah. And you got to be somewhere where, you're going to be disciplined. You may not like everything that's said to you or what's instructed to you, but you got to be a place where you're going to be. It was some nights, we was in that basement, man, and it was like, man, are we really here 4 hours?
Right.
But that's, the discipline it took, and I wasn't going to question. If the class was next week, I was going to be right there, in the class. And then I needed to be held accountable. I needed my pastor to know, because at that time I'm working. I'm just not, I'm not in ministry full time. I have a job, but I'm gonna let my pastor know, hey, I gotta work on Wednesday. So if you don't see me on Wednesday, I'm not gonna be down there. And a lot of guys don't understand that when you make yourself committed to your pastor in your church, that you know, God will make room for you, and he'll do stuff to your pastor. I mean, I think about how I got my office at Mount Sinai. It wasn't because I was doing certain stuff. I was down there in the kitchen and anywhere else I could find a place to study until you were kind of like, hey, look, we need to get this guy an office. You know, now that wouldn't have come. I wasn't looking to get an office, but I was committed enough to make myself, you know, available in the space that I was given.
Sure, and it's not, you know, you can't start with trying to get a title office
Oh,
job.
no.
It's not where you can start.
Right.
You got to start by serving.
Right.
And there are people over our lifetime who we've seen that seem to come up from nowhere, and God raised them up.
Right.
And there is this sense that I'm just one engagement away from blowing up, but nobody comes from nowhere.
Right.
You know, you don't know the background stories.
Right.
Of even the people that God seems to be,
Right.
you know, raising up. You know, I'm 35 years old when I come here,
Right.
but I'm not I got a long way to go, but I wasn't a rookie, you know.
Right.
I've been
right,
pastoring
right.
for 17,
Right,
18
right.
years, you know, and some of the things I've been doing here was just, I may seem like I'm in a rhythm because I was just trying to do the same things
Right.
there.
Right.
You know, no one comes from nowhere.
Right.
And there is this paying your dues process that most of us are just not going to get out of, right?
Right. Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. Exactly.
And if you're trying to get out of that to just catapult to something, you're going to set yourself up for disappointment.
You really
If you are faithful where you are, the Lord knows where you are, and he knows how to get you to wherever it is he wants you to be.
Right. Right. And that's been my, you know, I've stuck my flag in the sand. Again, I've been there 22 years, and I've just tried to be.
Did you think you'd be there that long?
No.
Sure.
No, I didn't think I would be there as long as I've been, and I honestly didn't think that I would be there to start. I just always had something different in my mind.
Sure.
But God saw otherwise, and the 22 years has, you know, gone by. I don't know how long God is going to leave me there, but I tell guys all the time, wherever you find yourself and wherever you're serving, you cannot serve God in your present pastorate looking out the window.
Yeah.
You got to be faithful where you are until God opens up that door. And I just think that God will honor the faithfulness and the commitment. You know, there's a lot of guys get in situations and they want bigger and, you know, and they want more. Dr. Wade, we tease him all the time. Sometimes he's dressed and he's in a nice suit, and we'll tease him and say, boy, when I grow up, I want to be like you. And I never will. He always says, are you sure you want what I got? He said, you might have to get some bone marrow cancer to get what I got. In other words, you don't know what I had to go through to get where I am. And so it's easy to look at that, but you don't know, you know, and this hasn't been an easy, you know, journey for me. I thank God for where we are and what's going on, but I can remember some weeks where, hey, it wasn't enough money, you know, to pay me. I mean, and I had to ask myself, are you doing this for the check? Or are you doing this because God has called you to serve, you know, in this ministry? I've had it where I've had a few people and I've had more people, and it's been ups and downs. But even with that, I tell people, with the space he's allowed us to get, we never complained about the small space. We didn't use that as an excuse to not do ministry and not do what God called us to do. And I just think when you learn to be faithful with whatever God has assigned you to do, then he can bless you with more to do what he needs you to do.
Yeah. Absolutely, man. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, man, it's been a joy to talk to you.
been
I'm
a joy.
rejoicing for all God is doing in you, man, and through you. Stay the course, buddy.
All right, and thank you, man. I appreciate the opportunity and just to be here to talk with you and to preach with you, and we in LA rooting you on, man. We rooting you on from the West Coast.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, man.
All right.
Y'all love y'all's prodigal son. I appreciate it. Amen.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you.